Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the University of Notre Dame and the Irish Studies Department here in Keough-Naughton. I'm Shantae McTon-Kenyon. I am a Moreau postdoctoral fellow here at Notre Dame and a former NEH fellow myself. And today we're welcoming Stephen O'Neill from Belfast. Stephen was the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow, the NEH Fellow for the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame for the previous academic year. He has also taught at the School of English at Trinity College Dublin and at Queen's University Belfast. He completed his PhD in 2018 at Trinity College. He's currently working on a book about the partition and Irish culture, and that's just what we're here to talk about today. So Stephen, if you don't mind, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Shantae. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of what I want to talk about. Hopefully it'll be as structured as I try and make it out to be now. So the first part of it, I'll play a video and discuss it a bit, and then I'll sort of discuss how this is very much in keeping with versions of partition that happen since the event, really, or since it began. And then I'll talk a little bit about the peace process and particularly John Hume and how he configures partition in a particular way. And then I'll get into representations of partition at the end and really look at sort of newspaper discourse and then novels. But I thought I would start anyway with a video that took place in the sort of 26th of November 2012 on the Late Late Show, an exchange between David Cameron and David Letterman. So if Tim could start the video, that would be brilliant.
All right. So
don't forget Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland. Now explain for me. I've never been able to hold this in my head. The difference between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
Right.
Northern Ireland is part of England.
Yes. Part of the United Kingdom.
I'm sorry.
So
that's right.
There was a time when all of Ireland was part of the United Kingdom.
There
was then a movement for Irish independence. Mm-hmm. And when that happened, the north of Ireland decided it wanted to stay with the United Kingdom. So we have United Kingdom, including Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland.
Right.
And the Republic of Ireland is a separate country, but with which we now have, not in the United Kingdom, don't make that mistake, but we have very good relations between the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom.
And is Ireland, Northern Ireland, the division there is religious?
It's very complicated. There's a huge amount of history involved in this, partly based on some religious differences, but the majority of people who live in Northern Ireland, including both Protestants and Catholics, but both want to be part of the United Kingdom. So we had a big peace agreement, which was all about respecting the rights of people in Northern Ireland to determine their own future. Mm-hmm. And that's the way. And now relations between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland are incredibly good. Her Majesty the Queen visited the Republic of Ireland last year, and it was the first time a member of her family had been there since independence. It was a really big moment. And as the bonds now between the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom are very, very strong.
That should obviously, I think, say strong. So this almost seems like a piece of ancient history at the minute, especially given that it was 8 years ago and that, various things have happened since, not least Brexit. And Cameron, of course, is now out of a job. But, he's not telling porkies here. There's a lot of it is actually quite vague about partition, but in some ways respects at least what happened. But then when he goes on to talk about the peace process, he sort of dismisses it when Letterman asks about how this division sort of happened. And he says that it's a huge amount of history. And it's very complex. And I want to sort of suggest today, and really this will be like a major part of what I'm talking about, is that partition is something that we think we know. So we know what partition is, or at least we seem to think that we do. And as the story is often told, 100 years ago, the only possible democratic solution to the fallout of the Irish Revolution was the division of Ireland in the two states, one which was largely Catholic, nationalist and southern, another mostly Protestant, unionist and northern. As many have commented since, the border on the island, whatever its gestation, was as much of a mental as a geopolitical one, and its establishment was simply a reflection of the social and cultural makeup of the island as it developed since the plantation. So the border was something that respected, and is something that respects the wishes of the inhabitants of Ireland in the 1920s, with the unfortunate but unavoidable exception of those nationalists and unionists left on the wrong side of it. So this narrative has been repeated across many platforms since its original airing in unionist periodicals and rhetoric in the 1920s and 30s. And whether it was what Claire O'Halloran called in 1987 the outcome of irreconcilable differences, or something that was, in the words of John Wilson Foster, which is a bit more polemic, I think, thinkable, feasible, and even necessary, the creation of two jurisdictions on the island is often framed as the only practical solution to its ongoing conflicts. But what I want to stress today is that none of this practicality, none of this feasibility, or even none of this necessity was evident to those who were living in the early years of partition in the 1920s, or at least it wasn't evident to the majority of the people living in Ireland. And this is particularly true when we think about the shadow of the Boundary Commission, the Irish Revolution, and the violence that really engulfed this period. You're probably all sick of seeing electoral maps, but what I'm showing here on the left is an electoral map in 1918. It is, I should say, a propaganda poster as well, so it might not be entirely accurate, but it does show that, you know, this isn't the state that emerged from these conflicts. And even the border on the left seems to be the border of the historic province of Ulster, as opposed to what became the six-county state that became known erroneously, clearly, as Ulster. On the right-hand side, as late as 1924, we have a unionist cartoon in the Ulster Review, which demonstrates the uncertainty of what that boundary was going to be. The boundary line is simply a question mark. So what this represents, so particularly on the right, is that the speed by which this baffling process of state formation occurred was, in the words of Peter Leary, sudden and disorientating in a way that few historians, I think, have recognised fully. As Robert Lynch has recently commented, historical hindsight has certainly made the border appear fixed and solid, but this was not the perception or the reality in the early years of partition. So while I'm not concerned here with plotting a history of the beginning of partition or what happened since necessarily, I think it must be recognised that the euphemistic ways in which the division of Ireland has been figured since, and the ambiguous ways in the case of Cameron, has done little to recognise the actuality of this process. And the transformation from a temporary solution to a lasting settlement, or a semi-permanent settlement, was and has been facilitated by the secrecy with which the process actually occurred. And this confusion about it has extended even to attempts to define and articulate the history of partition itself. Many of these founder on the specific details of how it happened. In Paul Bew, Peter Gibbon, and Henry Patterson's History of the Northern State, for example, claim that the book claims what they call Northern Ireland was founded in 1921, or more precisely between that date and 1925, when the report of the Boundary Commission left the border as it was. However much it had threatened the permanence of the new Northern State, the Boundary Commission famously did not leave the border as it was, but it was so kind of controversial in its changes that it remained unpublished for what all sides interpreted as its failure. Instead, it was actually the tripartite agreement signed on the 3rd of December 1925 between the three governments, that is to say, Stanley Baldwin's government in Westminster, James Craig's government, and W.T. Cosgrave's government as well, formed the final settlement of the boundary. And this is an excerpt from the agreement itself, which I think is very telling in terms of how we have viewed partition since, but also in terms of how we're able to remember any of it. So Cosgrave is taking part in these negotiations and talks about how they're going to bury the Boundary Commission, and says that the report should be burned or buried because another set of circumstances had arrived and a bigger settlement had been reached. And then James Craig says that he himself had not seen the map of the proposed new boundary. When he returned home, he would be questioned on the subject, and he preferred to be able to say that he did not know the terms of the proposed award. He was certain that it would be better that no one should ever know accurately what their position would have been. So there's quite a few things to unpack here. Basically, the consensus on both sides that the report should not only be forgotten, but that neither Craig nor Cosgrave wanted to have any knowledge of it at all. I mean, Cosgrave himself later replies that he was of the same view as James Craig in regard to examining the map of the Boundary Commission. That is to say, out of sight, out of mind. And the suppression of the report, I mean, thankfully it was buried rather than burned, meant that the actual process by which the shape of each state was divided and what might have happened was only known to a few people, and that any alternative sort of territory, maps or territorial configurations of each state were hidden from the public for almost half a century. Of course, while there was that leak in the Morning Post, it wasn't necessarily something that people believed or necessarily at the time felt that was what the Boundary Commission was actually deciding. But I think importantly as well, there's two major implications for both premiers and their states. So Craig, whose government had entirely more or less boycotted the Boundary Commission anyway, could claim that the northern state was a natural divide whose guarantor was centuries of history and culture and economy, whereas Cosgrave could simply ignore the abject failure of his government to protect the interests of those living on the border of northern nationalists, and also could leverage it, I think, as is known, for imperial war debt. So with both states now sequestered in territories that no one had asked for or mostly even envisaged in the years preceding its implementation, the suppression of the Boundary Commission's report also entailed the silencing of those communities left on the wrong side of the new border. If no one was meant to know what the position of the Boundary Commission was to have been, then how can anyone remember partition itself, let alone assess its impact upon the future cultures and societies of the states that it basically copper fastened? So this ambiguity, this secrecy, is something that I'm really interested in. I mean, how this ambiguity and this secrecy means that the story of partition is incredibly malleable for future generations, and particularly in the context of various political organisations that sought or seek either to distract from the very anxious and very arbitrary origins of the northern state or the 26 county state, or those sort of nationalist or even non-kind of constitutionally aligned political formations that seek a more sort of moderate political settlement. The point being that while in the 1920s partition was for many what Robert Lynch calls a moment of deep personal and political tragedy, writing or telling the history of Ireland's division since then has often resembled a farce. So, introducing the 2004 reissue of Benedict Kiley's Counties of Contention, a story of the origins and implications of the partition of Ireland, John Hume described its reappearance as a welcome and timely contribution to the process of political development and reconciliation on our island. And this came shortly after Hume's retirement and in the aftermath of the Good Friday Agreement, with the occasion allowing the former SDLP leader to strike an optimistic note on the future of the island. Counties of Contention, for Hume anyway, provide a useful crutch to argue that the Irish situation had arisen not out of agreement, but disagreement and understanding, with Hume framing the 1945 study as a forerunner to his own recent achievements. We can see him here on the slide with George Gipp for Notre Dame people, but also Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And as he talks, and I think it's very important to look at the language here, this was a forward-looking analysis. Of course, we now have an agreement which finally came over 4 decades and much strife later. This work was, therefore, in many ways ahead of its time. The author declares modestly that the work was not intended as a resolution or a remedy, but as a recording of thoughts and observations which may help the task of the new generation. That generation was the generation that endorsed the Good Friday Agreement, and it now has the task of implementing it. So if we just look a little bit of the language here, it's not on the slide, but he talks about it as a forward-looking analysis, and about like how this new agreement was won after 4 decades. And Yen also says that the work is ahead of its time, which we'll come to in a little bit. But particularly, I think, although it's in praise of, say, Benedict Kiley's work, Hume's reinterpretation is also clearly in service of validating his own political career. And there was some evidence for this connection, as Kiley had claimed in a section which approximated the principle of consent underlining the Good Friday Agreement. If I were given the choice tomorrow between the continuance of partition and a one government Ireland ruling the Protestants of Ulster against their will, I would choose a partitioned Ireland. With Hume at least also temporarily choosing a partitioned Ireland against the aspiration of unity, Counties of Contention appeared as an ideal moral and ideological antecedent for 1998. However, and if we think about the language and the very temporal language that's being adopted here, the obsolescence of Kiley's anti-partitionism was also stressed in his introduction, where Kiley wrote in 1945 of a mistaken perception that the common Irish nationalists possessed a mind acid with meditating on the persecutions and injustices of the past. Hume also seemed to characterise older generations of Irish nationalists in the same way. So what he saw as the Good Friday, sorry, let's get this slide here. Excuse me, sorry. What he saw as the Good Friday Agreement's rejection of past violence for a peaceful future was facilitated for him by a form of forgetting that rendered Tidy's concern with partition as a cultural artifact. So stressing that it was written 6 decades ago and that it concentrated on partition, he calls it an enclosing wall, which was the problem to be resolved. And then he makes, I think, a very telling statement. He says that partition was, of course, a vivid memory at the time of writing and was still a shock and hurt in nationalist Ireland. So again, we look at the temporization of partition as an anti-partitionism in particular as a form of political action. But also what we see here is partition being represented as a memory, and almost a memory of a memory for Hume, not something which actively operates on his present, but which is the sole preserve of a past generation. And clearly for Hume, this border is not the problem to be resolved. And anti-partitionism, as he goes on to say, which again we can see here says it lacks a vivid form of remembrance, i.e. it's a dead sort of a political aspiration, retains only minor historical curiosity, and counties of contention held its greatest appeal for him, as he says, not as a politician, but as a past teacher of history and French. The Good Friday Agreement, by contrast, was at once the achievement of a generation and its most pressing task, the beginning of the future, and in some respects here, the end of memory. So such productions of time and memory recurred in Hume's many arguments for peace, and this dismissal of partition echoed his own comments actually a decade later. In these, he claimed, a decade earlier, I should say. In these, he claimed that the real division in Ireland is not the line in the map that we call partition. That line in the map simply institutionalized a division that has existed for centuries in the hearts and minds of the Irish people. That is where the real border in Ireland lies, in the hearts and minds of the people. Now we can see this as a particularly, I think, cliched rendering of partition, one that clearly draws upon formulations by Oliver MacDonagh, by F.S.L. Lyons, and by J.C. Beckett, which are like also clearly in service of not recognizing what the institutions which actually perpetuated or even established this division are. But again, it's this idea that partition is not something as a historical event anyway that has any relevance to 1994. So arguments about the past, and particularly about nationalist renditions of the past, are particularly emboldened, I think, around the time of the 1998 agreement, and for maybe very good reasons. As Mary Holland pronounced in the Irish Times 3 days after the referendum was passed, the overwhelming mandate of an All-Ireland referendum had vindicated Hume's war against what she termed the theology of the past. Well, this was an understandable tone, I think, to adopt in the moment of its triumph. The agreement has since often been claimed as a new dispensation on the island of Ireland for, again, very good reasons. But it has also had a kind of backwards compatibility for narratives of Irish history which stretch well beyond its establishment. And we don't really need to search too far than Seamus Mann's declaration on the day of the document as a Sunningdale for slow learners to see this. So foregrounded as an international peace agreement, which is won by years of hard negotiation, the achievement of Good Friday, I think, often continues to shape and condition the ways in which the past is remembered in Ireland. As a supposed endpoint, I think, of a trajectory from violence to peace, it is also often used to police what can or should be forgotten in the moment, the brains of the living weighing like a nightmare on the dead generations. Hume's dismissal of partition as a mere scholarly curiosity in 2004, however, may also have approximated what was then a significantly low support for United Ireland in the immediate post-agreement landscape. But I think also what's important to note is that practiced ignorance around the subject of partition has also been a recurring element of arguments against Irish unity since the 1920s. In his The Revolution in Ireland, 1906 to 1923, the Unionist historian W.A. Phillips, for example, had claimed that the memory of the Irish peasant is very long, he has no sense of historical perspective, and the wrongs suffered by his ancestors centuries ago are to him as things of yesterday. So this kind of regulation of memory of what should be remembered, and also what is useless memory, if you think about the idea of the wrongs suffered by his ancestors centuries ago, this idea that other people have moved on, it even extends, I think, in some respects to the topic of researching partition itself. As Margaret O'Callaghan wrote in 2006, lamenting the lack of scholarly work on what were deemed to be, as she terms them, unhelpful topics for an Irish historian. She says, when working on the Boundary Commission of 1925 a few years ago, an eminent colleague asked me why I wanted to go digging up all that old stuff. As O'Callaghan reflected, this was a difficult question for an historian to answer. So partition was almost as difficult and unhelpful a subject in 2006 as it was in 1925. As Emily Pine reflects, Irish memory culture is characterised by selective remembering, and often the selectivity is motivated by the political aspects of certain memories. Writing about the ways in which 1916 had been commemorated by the Irish state, she refers to the shifting political meanings of memory, in this case due to the intervening years of the peace process. As Pine develops this argument, these shifting political meanings made expanded forms of memory possible. So it's quite a really interesting sort of expose or analysis of how the Irish Free State, the Irish Republic, commemorated 1916 since the event. In 2006 was the first time, I think, in 30 years that they actually included the Irish Army, and this is something which is read, I think, as being something that is facilitated really by the peace process as opposed to something which they simply decided. I think it's very striking that these expanded forms of memory, which are certainly evident in many respects and have been evident in many respects since the peace process and since 1998, have not led, though, to any understanding of the arbitrary, contradictory, and in some respects anti-democratic ways in which partition began.
Stephen, if you don't mind, can I interrupt for a second?
Absolutely, yeah.
No, I'm thinking about some of the language that you've been using, and I'm thinking about how someone writes about contested history.
Yeah.
And that video with Cameron really stands out because he makes this process seem like it was quite pleasant. You know, even the way that he responds to the question, was it religious? And he there's this sigh, and he's like, oh, well, it's complicated. And so the language that you've used is kind of like confusion, secrecy, and then also talking about memory and bringing up Emily Pine and thinking about the selective memory of Ireland. And so I'm really curious then how one researches a topic that is so, even though it's recent history in some respect, right? How does one go about evaluating such a contested subject, even looking at 1998 or, you know, the 70s or in the 1920s? Like, how do you approach this subject? How do you write about it, both from a literary perspective and a historical perspective?
Well, exactly. It's very difficult. I mean, that's the whole point about the Margaret O'Callaghan thing. Exactly right. That, you know, it is all these are difficult questions for historians to answer whenever there is, I mean, as she is documenting, some active resistance to the idea of like looking at these particular forms of history and looking particularly at the Boundary Commission because it brings up such active and such, well, what some people would see dangerous memories. And particularly, I think what has been difficult, much of the kind of stuff that I would be researching is things that are almost, you know, kind of hidden in plain sight. So, you know, just novels that were popular at the time that I haven't really ever seen in literary histories of Ireland, and poems, and, you know, even periodicals that are openly available in the National Library, which I've never seen really being used by anybody. So what I find quite interesting about this is maybe one thing I might think about maybe in the question and answer afterwards is the idea that there has also been this kind of reading, and Seamus Dean, who I'm going to talk about in a bit, of the North and the South as sort of different cultural entities. And also a reading, I think, of Irish literary history in a very partitioned way. Another thing I can talk about afterwards, rather than maybe get into it now. But many of the kind of major histories of Irish literature, particularly in the 20th century, do not really account for partition in any sustained way, and sometimes completely elide or ignore very many popular or even just, you know, critically crucial novelists and writers from the North. That sort of brings me on actually to the literary aspect as well. So I'll try and share my screen again here. Brilliant. So part of the part of what I've been looking at in terms of like trying to think about sort of writing a history or cultural or just literary history of partition is basically attitudes towards it, and why, you know, as someone who was born in 1988 and grew up really during the peace process, what the attitudes to partition were then, why in fact I didn't know that much about it, and why I had to like really sort of think about like chronologizing it properly, and think about like various aspects of it that I knew nothing about. And what I thought was very interesting is that I realized that like quite a lot, as was the case with the video at the start, there's quite a lot of bad versions of partition out there. And this is just one example, a very prominent example, I think, not for this particular article, but in the Belfast Telegraph edition that carried the announcement of the Provisional IRA ceasefire on the 31st of August 1994, there was an article entitled, on the 7th page, Seeds of Conflict Were Sown in the Past. And this is a way of contextualizing what I'll call the IRA's armed struggle. This anonymous piece began with a brief summary of events in Ireland from 1921 to 1968. So many historians believe the seeds of violence of the past 25 years were sown back in 1921. It was then that 1 million Protestants persuaded the British government they should be excluded from Irish independence. The new Dublin government reluctantly agreed that the 6 northeastern counties of the island should remain under the British flag. Unionists set up their own government at Stormont, and for more than 40 years, the province was virtually left to its own devices. So there's so many things factually inaccurate here, which I wonder how many historians they actually consulted here. Certainly didn't name them, which is quite interesting. But the references to Stormont, which was opened in 1932, and 1 million Protestants, of which there was, I mean, they're rounding up, but it's 850,000 in the 1926 census. We can maybe forgive those. But the given impression here was one that the islands division was a matter of almost persuasion rather than coercion. And I think also the complication that they don't remotely mention Northern nationalists at all. And that's not even remote. I mean, I understand this isn't, you know, meant to be a scholarly work of history, but there's so many ways in which they also ignore, say, the sort of complication of the Boundary Commission and sort of frame the division of Ireland as a reluctant agreement between new neighbours and a gentle kind of parting of the ways. I mean, obviously, on this day, as the front page will show, you know, and the language adopted by the editorial, it's very clear about, and I think rightly, you know, about what should be remembered on that day, and also it's also very specific, which is completely appropriate, I think, for that particular time. But what's very interesting, I think, is the way that the editorial frames the Troubles itself. It says that time blurs the public's memory of such atrocities as the Abercorn, Bloody Sunday in Enniskillen, as well as the Ormer Road, Greysteel and Loughlin Island massacres, but they will never be forgotten by those whose lives were permanently damaged. And whether appropriately or not, there is a hierarchy of memory being adopted here. There is one that, you know, there's certain things that partition and kind of the Troubles of the 1920s are seen as historical mystery, whereas more kind of recent, for obvious reasons, the more recent Troubles is basically said as something that will never be forgotten. And so partition was understandably, I think, not headline news in 1994, but I would argue that its history at least retained minor relevance to a conflict in which at least one of the parties was seeking to end it and others were seeking to maintain it. That's a very narrow version of the Troubles in some ways, but it is, I think, a very important aspect of it. The form of the Belfast Telegraph that day, however, I think also serves as a reminder of hierarchies of memory, and hierarchies of memory were actually, I think, quite interestingly adopted in novels of the later Troubles, which document the peace negotiations and in some cases actually anticipate the eventual settlement. What is striking here, though, is that the history of the North Formation is not actually taken seriously by many of these novels, or it is dramatised as irrelevant to the contemporary situation. So this is going to be a very potted literary history here, and a very limited and specific reading of novels. And I'm not concerned here with particular plot details, so I'm not going to spoil them that much. But what I am going to suggest is that very similar aspects of representing partition occur here, with the exception, I think, of the last example. And so when I mentioned that partition was often represented by farce, it's not just in terms of serious attempts, I think, to record it, but also in terms of how it is configured in novels of the later peace process. And this is, I think, certainly the case generally in the novels of Robert McGinn Wilson, and in some aspects, I think, of Len Patterson's novels. In Wilson's Eureka Street, which anticipates and lampoons some of the capitalist elements of the peace process, a metaphor of Ireland for sale briefly mentions partition as a significant flaw. So this is Chucky Lurgan, one of the main protagonists, who's visualizing the estate agent's description for the Ireland auction. Fine old country, recently partitioned, in need of minor political repair, price for quick sale. So that's very much in keeping, as I'll mention in a second, with the kind of sort of metaphors in the novel, with some of the ways it anticipates the attachment to sort of capital that the peace process and kind of retained, I think, and has retained. Glenn Patterson's Fat Lad, which was published 4 years before, and whose, I mean, the title is an acronym for, well, a unionist rendering of the Six Counties, uses the set piece of a classroom to ridicule the unionist interpretation of partition, but does so in a way which renders it nearly a puzzle to one of the main protagonists, Ellen Linden. So this comes after there is an anti-partition demonstration on TV, and or I think more of a civil rights demonstration. I'm not sure how much of that is actually anti-partition, but her teacher basically starts trying to give a history of the sort of divisive or divided island of Ireland. So the island of Ireland has never contained a single unified people, Mr. Craig said, any more than the island of Britain has. The 1920 border only reconfirmed what this diagram of 6th century alliances shows to be true, that there have always been two Irelands. And then as it goes on through one of the sort of central protagonists, and that, all as it might seem at that late stage of 1968, was the first time Ellen Linden had given any thought to the meaning of partition. So for both of these novels, partition is not so much a sideshow as something which is often the source of satire, something that shouldn't really be thought about too much. I should say that in Fat Lad, this directly is succeeded by a chapter in which one of the older characters actually remembers the day of the founding of the Northern Parliament. But this is also something which isn't really, the political aspect of that isn't seen as something which is for necessarily her. She's at home while all the men basically go to the demonstrations outside. The narrator of Eureka Street summarizes attitudes towards politics as they're represented, I think, by constitutional politics in describing one of the protagonists. History and politics were books on a shelf to Chucky, and Chucky was no reader. And within Eureka Street, in particular, any attempt to articulate a Republican perspective about history or politics, or a unionist one, is rendered ridiculous, a kind of literary Section 31 to plagiarize Declan Kybert. So aspects of this is also evident in some of the more serious novels about the Troubles, and novels which are concerned, I think, with the trauma of the conflict, the representation of partition in which is submerged, I think, by more recent memories of political protest and violence. Deirdre Madden's 1986 novel, One by One in the Darkness, for example, details the trauma of the Loyalist murder of the father of three daughters in South Derry. And although taking place across a week in the lives of its four main characters, the three daughters and the mother, that is, it does make some reference to memories of life in the North before the Civil Rights Movement and the Troubles. The only reflection upon the situation of the Catholic community in the novel before these events is framed as a kind of political awakening for the wife of the murdered victim, Emily, who sketches out her historical situation as one of like deep constraint. So at that time, politics meant Stormont, meant a Protestant government for Protestant people. So if you happened to be a Catholic, the message was clear. You just worked as hard as possible within the tiny scope that was allowed you. So this, again, registers a skeptical attitude towards politics, and again, generally meaning constitutional politics. The clear limitation of this scope for the civil rights generation and sort of sense of fatalism, which is rendered, I think, in these lines, pervades much of the rest of the novel, which, I mean, really deals with how memory is shaped and conditioned by a traumatic event. And I hope Ellie Davis agrees with that. The corresponding political awakening of Emily's daughter, Helen, is similarly, I think, beset by limitations. And this awakening emerges as Helen reminisces about deciding her career path during her final year in school under the pressure of career advice from both parents and school authorities. After much pondering upon her future and her future whether she should stay or leave like her sister, the final line of the chapter suggests the border like Hume and Patterson as academic. So only her history homework remained, describe and assess the circumstances which led to the partition of Northern Ireland. The description here of the partition of Northern Ireland is actually a chronological fallacy, since the Six County state was the product rather than the subject of partition. And I think this logical inadequacy of the question underlines both the reduced historical view of One by One in the Darkness and its appropriateness, I think, for kind of, well, not bad versions necessarily of partition, but certainly very fatalist versions of partition in the context of the 1990s. And the last text I'll mention is Seamus Dean's Reading in the Dark. This is a novel which, I mean, is quite popular at the time, particularly in theoretical circles, and is also finished in the Desio Hall in Notre Dame, incidentally, in the English department, apparently in Chris Fox's old office. Many of the major heavyweights at the time, including Edna Longley, Declan Kiberd, and Carl Rumans, offered some commentary on the novel in terms of its engagements with representations of Ireland's history. So it's always like registered as being a commentary on Irish history, culture, and politics, which is unsurprising given who its author is and how much they have written on these subjects. But most of these commentaries make little mention of partition itself, despite its centrality to the novel in terms of its representation of the northern minority. For if it's been read by others, the coming of the later troubles in the sort of closing chapter of the novel. So the novel charts a period from 1922 to the Battle of the Bogside in 1971. So if, like the end of it, the coming of the troubles to Derry represents the return of the repressed, then partition sort of can be read as the original moment of repression in what is a heavily historicised narrative in Reading in the Dark. And the clear origin of the story, both in terms of its linear progression and the puzzle memory that it constantly attempts to solve, is the troubles of the early 1920s. And this memory is specifically framed by the author in an interview as a counter to the revealing narratives of Dean's youth. When we were growing up, all of the narrative codes were telling us something about ourselves, but we knew the police version couldn't be trusted, the government version couldn't be trusted, almost all the versions of the world were not to be trusted. So the memory of the murder of a policeman and the subsequent secrecy and family feud that emerges from this alternative code is the structuring mystery of the novel and certainly drives much of the narrative. But if this police version of the world as a code cannot be trusted, then it is striking that one of the most succinct commentaries on memory and history in the novel comes towards the end from Sgt Burke, the primary antagonist in Reading in the Dark. Politics destroyed people's lives in this place, he said. People were better not knowing some things, especially the younger people, for all that bother dragging them all their lives, and what was the point? Those were bad years, he said, the early 20s. Northern Ireland had a cruel birth. So this is a representative, a policeman, obviously, in the six-county state, and his presence in the novel overshadows much of the narrator's operations. He is constantly seen to be watching him, constantly trying to bring him in to get him to tout effectively on a family member. And in this excerpt, the idea that younger people should forget all about politics certainly accords with much of the other examples, but it also, I think, locates the action of the novel, particularly at that time, and also, very importantly, mentions it as the birth of the Northern state. And very briefly, closing, and I think opening it up to discussion, mercifully, I wanted to suggest that with the exception of Dean, all of these versions of partition and its memory are symptomatic of Dan Jacobson's maxim that it is perfectly possible to live without a memory. In some ways, it can be positively more comfortable to do so. As he says here, the discontinuities of colonial experience make it extremely difficult for any section of the population to develop a vital, effective belief in the past as a present concern and in the present as a consequence of the past actions. I should say, while he is specifically referring here to the colonial situation of South Africa, I think much of this serves as an effective description of the ways in which partition has been represented by literature, culture, and politics in the context of the peace process, and arguably also somewhat before that as well. So whether an unhelpful memory that is not relevant to the peace process or our contemporary, or something that is shorn of any relation to the realities of the 1920s, the partition of Ireland and the formation of the Northern State in particular is often, I think, a fable that we forget by, to use the phrase of Nancy Eisenberg. And this is something I think we should remember over the next couple of years when we are marking or not marking some of the sort of events that led or copper fastened the partition of Ireland. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Stephen. That was great. Thank you so much. You and I were actually talking last week, and you were telling me that celebrations of partition, commemoration of partition, were being planned, and that the global pandemic had kind of derailed some of these things, but that people were planning on commemorating the partition. And I remember going, why is that? Like, how, it's so confusing to me to think that this is going to happen, considering it's still contested space.
Yeah.
When you were talking, you said there was a quote that you used, and it said there has always been two Irelands.
Yeah.
And I, as you know, I do comparative work, and I saw a quote today actually from a writer for The Atlantic, and he says, face the bitter truth. We are two countries, and neither of them is going to be conquered or disappear anytime soon. And of course, he's talking about America and the current election and the current state of politics. And so I am thinking about this contested history and the partition in Ireland and how it's both physically and mentally embodied. And I don't know, I mean, what does this mean then that there's going to be a commemoration of this division, this line?
Yeah, I think that it's a very, very interesting question in terms of how even the mechanics of celebrating something like this. To the point that, say, for example, there's two Irelands. There's actually, I mean, as I think that's very limited, particularly in the contemporary situation where there's like more than two Irelands. There's multiple Irelands, of course, and it's a one way of framing like Ireland as being decided by its constitution or decided by its constitutional arrangement, which I find quite troubling. So how is it going to be commemorated? Well, interestingly, no one has listed anything about the Boundary Commission, so that's not even going to be talked about from what I understand. So it's not going to be commemorated in terms of the Boundary Commission. There's no plans to even mark that, from what I can understand. This year, the Boris Johnson has started a kind of, and the unionist government here not the unionist government here, but elements of the government here who are unionist, have started a sort of series of talks and events, many of which are being actually boycotted actively by the nationalist parties because they don't see it. So either people see it as the foundation of the northern state, or people see it as the beginning of partition, and that's the kind of contested terrain that we're going for here. But there's also about the difficulty really of commemorating something which doesn't happen, on a particular event, doesn't happen with any vote. So, well, sorry, it does happen with a vote, but the vote's centenary is actually, I think, next week on the 12th of November. And the vote is interesting in that it happens in Westminster, but not a single Irish vote is actually cast in favour of it. So how do you commemorate something that none of your representatives voted for? And, how do you also commemorate something which various elements of it were not really up for discussion in the public as well, and were then suppressed? That's the kind of difficulty that we're talking about here. And I think, so that the first slide that I shared is about that boundary, the question mark. The very interesting part about that is that nobody thought that was going to be the lasting settlement. So it's hard, that nobody saw it as being like a definitive moment at the time. Yeah. And then this sort of boundary victory for the northern state happens, and that kind of also, because they had boycotted it so much, there's no actual celebration of that either. So.
Okay, well, thank you. We have a couple questions. I'll go ahead and read the first one. So John Conlon asked, do you see any sort of change in the way that the quote unquote partition bit, as Seamus Heaney called it, gets portrayed in recent literature?
Hi, John, how are you going? How are you getting on? So is it the border bit or the partition bit? I think that a lot of the ways in which it gets represented in recent literature is actually more, and particularly I think if we expand this to include, say, RS Times columns, a lot of the discourse since Brexit has been about the border itself as opposed to partition. And I think there's two different things going on there. So people are actually fascinated with the idea of like the border as a site of investigation, right? But I actually think that what we maybe should be looking at is the state formation, like the kind of cultural formation of the states, not just the physical actualities of it. I think what's quite funny, I read something like Milkman, which I can just see on my shelf there, but read something like Milkman and see it as being deeply imbricated in the sort of partition sort of state, in terms of like it's deeply about the sort of northern state and deeply about living there. And I think maybe part of what we need to address here is thinking about how partition actually shapes and conditions any narrative written about the North which references its sort of constitutional structures. I think that's a really important point, which probably doesn't answer your question. So.
Okay, we have some more questions actually. Colin Barr asks, I wonder if you could possibly say anything about Irish American representations of partition, particularly in American fiction. I mean, we've also talked about the difference between the way Ireland is represented within the state primarily from my perspective from the Republic, but also from the North, and then that how it's so differently portrayed within America.
Yeah, American fiction, the one example I can think of, which is very niche, is American Pastoral by Philip Roth, in which he describes Olcott, I think is his name, the character, as being from Northern Ireland, or his ancestors as being from Northern Ireland, when his ancestors actually emigrated in the 1780s. So Philip Roth is Partition in Ireland about 150 years before the fact. In terms of literature, I'm not entirely sure. I haven't really seen too many representations of literature by Irish Americans, or I'm sure other people could correct me on that. But I think in terms of culture, what I find very interesting, just to flip the question, is that there's a number of sort of campaigns aimed at Irish Americans by anti-partition campaigns in the 1940s, and they actually start like basically saying that, would you split Michigan in two? Would you split, Georgia in two? And I'm sort of thinking of that in the electoral map when I put that up. Hopefully not. But that, actually they start using America as a site of influence. And I think this is obviously something that happens in political action in Ireland, like since really the 1920s and the Treaty of Versailles. That's another very bad answer. So apologies, Colin, but maybe if I'll try and send you that American pastoral expert to explain what I mean.
Thank you. Stephen Egan asks, my question is about the relationship between this difficult historical event and commemoration. As others may have seen, last week, the Derry and Strabane Council voted to not commemorate the centenary of the partition of Ireland next year. Given the difficulty of the topic at hand, because of the contested memories in play, is it possible to appropriately commemorate the event, or is it impossible?
I don't know that. So I was actually discussing this with a friend last week about the idea of commemoration and it being a very particular way of remembering something. Commemoration to me, I'm sure that obviously it generally, I think, involves the state, or at least some sort of public body, doing it really in public, like how we remember something in a particular structure. Yeah, I don't know how there's an appropriate way really to, commemorate. I think, to be fair, so Derry and Strabane are really resisting, as far as I know, commemorating the foundation of the Northern State as opposed to the partition itself. So that's the interesting thing here. I think it talks to the different memories which are being worked on here. Like one of them is, for a lot of people, say the idea of like either being left on the wrong side of this border and basically being cut off from their center of like cultural and political influence. And for another, it's the beginning of a new cultural and political influence. So there's a lot of people, particularly in Derry, like it's so close to Donegal, and it's like there's quite a difference for them in terms of like how they view these things, because Derry was also something that was like very much up for grabs in the Boundary Commission, or at least should have been, according to many, whereas like in Belfast it was just never ever going to be part of it. So I think what's interesting about that, just in terms of of how Derry and Strabane are commemorating it, I don't really see how they can commemorate that, say commemorate the foundation of the state, but also not commemorate the violence that happened in Derry as well. And that's something I find interesting about it, how it's been framed as the foundation of the state with the sort of speech of King George opening Parliament in City Hall. It's not actually being framed as a time of deep uncertainty and violence, and a lot of displacement as well.
Daniel Carey, he has written in to ask. He says he agrees with you on how literary histories alike the border, or rather how the border determines areas of focus to an inordinate degree. He wants to ask about the anomaly or peculiarity of Donegal, which we, of course, just came up in the last answer. If the border is somehow natural or given, Donegal stands as a distinctive reminder of an alternative scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. But because it's the idea of like the northmost point of Ireland being in Malin in Donegal, so that the actual name of the state itself seems to be sort of out with the question. So I think what's very interesting about this anyway is that lots of literature is written in the 1920s and 30s about Donegal. Forrest Reid bases a lot of his writing there. There's obviously other people like Pater O'Donnell who are writing about this as well. And Donegal just seems to be a complication. But even in Unionist culture, I mean, there's tourist guides to the new Northern State, which just include Donegal for, you know, whatever reason. They just say it's ours too. So it's a very interesting like part which has never really been properly incorporated. As Frank Shovelin, who's probably listening, will tell you. But I've never, and I think one of the interesting ones actually, just in terms of maybe not the 1990s, but 1925, 1931, sorry, is The Knife by Pat O'Donnell, which actually talks about the lagging community in Donegal and all of the sort of place that actually in the Boundary Commission was probably going to transfer to the north. The final thing I'll say, just to go on, is that like one of the problems with the Boundary Commission being copper fastened, and I wonder what would have happened, is that, you know, the county, which is very, you know, it is incredibly important in Irish history and culture, and you know, even the GAA is organised around counties. If the Boundary Commission had, say, given land in Fermanagh to the Free State, or if the Boundary Commission had given land Donegal to the north, how would that have affected like people's sense of counties as well? How would that affected the idea of like in All Ireland, would someone who's in the Lagan district play for Tyrone? They would be very unhappy with that. Anyway.
Yeah, we actually have quite a few questions and not much time. I'll try to get to as many as possible. Brian, I'm not going to be able to get your last name right, so I'm not going to try to pronounce it. I apologize. Brian asks, did any sporting cultural organization other than the GAA or rugby ignore partition?
I don't know. I'm not. The person who's written about this is oh God, his name. I should give his book a plug. Brian, I will definitely send you the book. I can't remember the guy's name, which is horrible. But he talks about the sort of division of partition. I don't think that. So I think that hockey might be organised on an Ireland basis. I'm not sure, but I'm almost certain that it was only until the 1950s or 1940s maybe that the soccer was changed. But we'll talk about that. Sorry, Brian, I don't know.
Okay, and then there's another question that's come in. Had the Celtic tiger had an impact on the depiction of partition in recent Irish literature?
Arguably, no, this is just a very, I don't have any very specific examples. I think arguably it might have led to kind of an embrace of like capitalism, an embrace of like a kind of let things stay as they are. I don't really think it's had too much. I mean, because I don't think much of writing from the 26 counties has really talked that much about it anyway. I think it's probably been overshadowed more by depictions of the north. And I could give various samples of that, but it's not really relevant. So I don't think so. I think the Celtic tiger hasn't really impacted it at all, but I could be wrong about that, and someone will tell me if I am. So
okay. Eugene McNulty asks, I wonder, could Stephen speak a little bit about the border as something now really imbricated into some forms of identity? He says he's thinking here of Garrett Carr's sense of the border, dividing Ireland in three. And you mentioned this actually in your talk rather than two. So north, south, and then the borderlands.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, that a lot of people see themselves as living on the border. And I mean, if anyone reads Peter Leary's book, Unapproved Routes, you will get an absolutely amazing like sense of this, in which like the border communities were actually very much something that had a distinct sort of cultural and sort of social identity as well. And we're only really learning the history of that as well. So I think that's absolutely true. And I think also that that's very much reflected, I think, more so in like recent novels. Like, I mean, I think definitely, definitely Darren's novels, but also I think ones by named Michael Hughes as well. So Country, which is that as well. And even Patrick Kavanagh. I can't read Patrick Kavanagh as anything other than a border poet as well. But
so then, and question is also is coming from Liam Lanigan, but it's kind of relating to the question that we just had. We're talking about memory in your talk. You're talking about the contested history. Is it remembered differently based on space as well? Like, how are these divisions happening, and how are the selective memories, if we're going to use Emily Pine's thinking here, how are these selective memories categoried or embodied within the physical space you're in, but also like your allegiance and what you see as the history. So is it different in the North and the South and the borderlands, or people remembering it differently? Is it not just a contested space, but is it a contested memory as well? I guess based on where you are physically embodied, where you physically live.
I mean, so I spent my PhD trying to find, I wasn't really finding, wasn't meant to find representation of partition, but I ended up trying to find quite a lot of them. And I spent the past while trying to find them. And really in fiction from the South, I don't really see any way in which it's remembered. I think partially because the Civil War probably predominates as a site of memory rather than partition, really. In the North, so examples include, I suppose, The Wayward Man by St John O'Byrne and Cape Row by Agnes Romilly White. These don't really talk about partition either. They actually almost short-circuited to the 1890s. So it's not really been remembered anywhere is the answer, or it's not been at least actively remembered and sort of talked about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Okay, well, let's bring it back to the States for as we wrap it up. Patrick Griffin has a question, also thinking about America and how the American memory of Ireland fits in here. He asks, in the US, we have two migrant traditions from Ireland, the Irish and the Scot-Irish. Kirby Miller has called this two traditions idea an aspect of partisanness, reimagination, and by extension, a distortion. Has something similar happened in Ireland? Have the partitionist visions shaped the ways that people insist the past should be imagined?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because simply, even from I think some people have asked about the idea of how partition is remembered, or troubles the idea of a memory for the southern state as well. It just shapes and conditions, I think, the way everything is remembered, partition, because it's often done through the state. And maybe I'm just particularly interested, as someone who pretends to read Gramsci all the time, in terms of the idea of the state as a kind of cultural formation and deeply impacting culture. What I find very striking about the sort of Scots-Irish and the Irish is that division is always being kind of represented in particular ways, but particularly with regards to, say, how Unionists see their active involvement in the Irish Revolution and really foreground their idea of Ireland as being something that is their idea of America as being something that they basically built. So they Unionists actually see the Scots-Irish as being their kind of cousins, more or less, which is interesting just in relation to how this actually partitions the idea of Irish America as well from, the North, as opposed to being in America.
And then the last question we'll take is from Brendan Donegal. He says, in America now, there has been controversy over how to deal with the Civil War and Civil War era figures, as well as other historical figures such as Christopher Columbus or Thomas Jefferson. Part of this problem is commemoration, but another is how it is taught in schools. Is there similar debate over how partition is taught in Ireland and in the UK?
By the UK, I mean, I would imagine that absolutely means the North, because nobody teaches history of Ireland from what we know in anywhere across the pond anyway. And I wasn't educated certainly in the South, so I don't know much about how it is. I mean, my friend Colin McGarrett would be able to tell more on that. And certainly partition didn't really come up as a subject, as a separate subject in my studies either. Really, history as a general subject in the North is a very contested idea. I mean, it's the way history is taught in schools is actually quite anodyne for that reason. People don't really learn that much about the formation of the state at all, and I think for similar reasons to some of the arguments being made that it's useless memory or dangerous memory. So that is very much the case. It is a very contested area.
I think it's a contested area here in the States as well, and I think it shapes how you engage in current political debates as well as what you learn about history. So that makes sense. Well, we actually have to wrap it up. We have a lot more questions. You can maybe answer them later, Stephen, but everyone, thank you for such a great talk. And so we really appreciate it, and we'll see everyone next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Cheers.
Bye. See you soon.